Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Friday afternoon. Thank you so much for joining. I'm very excited about this afternoon's panel, and thank you so much for joining. So welcome to the Refugee Law Initiative conference panel, session 5C. Hopefully you're in the right place. We've got a wonderful panel who are going to be talking and sharing and thinking with us around the contemporary role of the global refugee regime in Sub-Saharan Africa. So the panel itself is designed to explore the different ways in which the current protection regime, the current global refugee regime, applies and is relevant or not in the Southern African context. And we draw here to frame our panel today on the work of Lauren Landau and Ronnie Amit from work that was published back in 2014, where they refer to the global refugee regime as something that may be akin to a distant weather pattern with only indirect and rarely determinative effects on local actions for refugees in the region. So I'm hoping that today, through the inputs from the panel and from the participation of you all, looking forward to unpacking what this means. And whilst a Friday afternoon can often be, you know, the kind of like very difficult time to keep people's attention, what I'm hoping is that due to the inputs over the past few days, and I think the really important provocations that have been presented, we might have an opportunity to draw on those and bring some issues together this afternoon. So each of the four speakers will have, well, I'll explain, the three speakers today will have 10 minutes each. And as with the other panels and sessions, I've been asked to enforce this very strictly, and I will be doing so. We really invite you to please pose your own questions and comments to the speakers by using the chat box function. And what we will be doing is opening up a discussion in conversation with the panelists that I will facilitate through the contributions made in the chat box. So I really encourage you to participate. As with other sessions, we will be drawing the discussion together after the four inputs, but please continue to pose questions, comments, thoughts, thinking through the connections perhaps between the different inputs and so forth. So we are going to now turn to our first speaker, who is Dr. Kudakwashe Vanyoro from Wits University, a colleague of mine. I'm Jo Vearey. I'm an associate professor and director of the African Center for Migration and Society at Wits University. And I'm also part of the Protect project, which is an EU-funded project exploring globalization and nativization and exploring the role of global protection in the contemporary world. And I'm delighted to be co-hosting, as it were, this panel under those two hats. So one note before we start is that unfortunately our colleague Noel Zempija is unfortunately unwell. He unfortunately is in hospital at the moment and obviously passes his regards to us, and we have obviously been passing our well wishes to him. So unfortunately, Noah is not with us today, but we will of course be engaging with him as we move forward in future discussions. So Kuda, I will hand over to you and I will share your slides for you. You will have 10 minutes.
Okay, thanks, Jo. I hope everyone, you can hear me. Yeah. Can I start now? Yeah, you can hear me. Great. Thanks, Jo. All right. So today I'm going to be talking about a topic I've aptly named, now that Mugabe is gone, you're free, categorizing and differentiating persons of concern at the Zimbabwe-South Africa border. Could you please share the next slide, Jo? So in this presentation, I'm interested in probing what it is that happens to migrants or would-be asylum seekers at African borders when they no longer necessarily elicit the same humanitarian compassion or sympathy because the political community no longer views their displacement as arising from political crisis or persecution. And in the case of Zimbabwean migrants seeking asylum and livelihoods at the Zimbabwe-South Africa border, this scenario has led to practices of differentiation that have not only reshaped institutional relationships, but also translated into a protection regime that de facto excludes them, as their political categorization has gradually shifted from the remit of political persecution articulated in conventional refugee law. I argue that this politics of concern somewhat reveals how South Africa's refugee regime is not so much shaped or influenced by refugee law alone, but by its interaction with expedient, localized idioms, expressions, and interpretations of political crisis and their multiple overlapping temporalities. And these interactions materialize into practices that shift the focus of actors such as the UNHCR from offering international protection to these kinds of migrants. And we see them beginning to ration the provision of basic needs such as food, soap, blankets, shelter, to name but a few, based upon categorical rationalities of refugee protection in ways that give a very minimalist value and meaning in the lives of these Zimbabwean migrants. These actors expediently use the state positioning that these people are free because their displacement only arises from economic factors, not so much political ones, because Mugabe, their source, is gone, to withdraw social and legal protections from Zimbabweans by effectively delegitimizing their persecution, particularly as socioeconomic deprivation as a novel protection issue is not considered under serious harms. So my first exercise in this presentation is to briefly draw the connections between the Zimbabwean crisis and the figure of the Zimbabwean economic migrant in South Africa. Under the leadership of Robert Mugabe, Zimbabwe experienced a meltdown that many of us may know that was characterized by rapid inflation and eroding value of salaries and shortage of commodities and goods, leading to a growing number of people leaving the country, mostly headed towards South Africa's vibrant economy. Next slide, please, Joe. Thanks. Thousands of these displaced and undocumented migrants sought refuge in the bushes and streets of Messina, which is located in northern South Africa, around 15 kilometers from the border, leading to an influx of a plethora of humanitarian actors who came in to assist these migrants as the bureaucratic state lacked the capacity to do so, leading to the opening as well of a refugee reception office that we see in that picture to process Zimbabwean migrants' asylum applications. And then on the night of 15 November 2017, Zimbabwe witnessed the first change in leadership since 1980, with Robert Mugabe leaving the position of president in 2017 through a somewhat coerced resignation. And many people hope that this would allow the country to recover from years of turmoil, economic and authoritarian rule. And since 2017, Zimbabwe has now been led by Mugabe's former ally, Emmerson Mnangagwa, who won a democratic election that was upheld by the compromised courts of law. And he purveyed an image of himself as an agent of change to root out corruption, election fraud, and transform the economy. However, many Zimbabweans have continued to come to South Africa for a combination of political, humanitarian, and economic reasons, and the images of congestion at the border in the festive season of 2020 at the height of a global pandemic bear testament to this. And I argue that South Africa's response to this coup gave legitimacy to the new dispensation, as it took place at a time when South Africa was the chair of SADC, and South Africa was not really decisive in trying to call out the coup for what it was. Yet the only thing that changed in Zimbabwe after that was the person, Mugabe himself, and not the ZANU-PF culture and administration. And by not condemning these actions, these external actors further marginalize Zimbabweans by enabling their continued oppression that continues through a regime that the international community has recognized as legitimate. And this paradigm shift on the Zimbabwean question is expedient because it allows external actors like South Africa, who receive migrants, to focus on responding to their own citizens' forgotten futures, particularly the urban poor. In this way, we can read the new dispensation in Zimbabwe's legitimation by the government of South Africa as an act that has generated or reinforced symbolic and internal boundaries of categorizing Zimbabweans as economic migrants who should not be protected since the crisis has been resolved, bringing to an end their vulnerability. So this is a perspective that focuses on Mugabe as responsible for the country of Zimbabwe, yet we know from utterances by prominent lawyer and MDC member Vearey, who was quoted as saying, life in Zimbabwe was better under President Robert Mugabe. So through this support of this government, or at least an ambivalent positioning around this issue, the country has, South Africa that is, has disregarded the cries of suffering Zimbabweans, enabling the society to perceive representations of Zimbabwean migrants experiencing physical and sexual harm or death in the most extreme cases at the border as instances of indigence that must be punished through more robust criminalization by means of more concerted border militarization. And this delegitimization of crisis aims at making South African citizens think that these strangers are deliberately exerting pressure and disregarding South Africa's border while transforming the Limpopo into a horrific place, leading as well to a scenario where the Refugee Reception Office is open to Zimbabwean migrants on paper, but has developed de facto gatekeeping methods of barring them from accessing any form of asylum. Next slide, please, Joe. So moving on from the representation of the crisis and how it morphs into a certain regime of exclusion, I'd like to look at how this de facto governance also shapes how UNHCR responds to these migrants due to their relationship with the state. The UNHCR, like the Department of Home Affairs, had also responded to the crisis by opening a field office in Musina in 2008. And at that time, it provided humanitarian aid to many migrants and supported faith-based organizations to set up temporary transit shelters to house those waiting for asylum permits. However, in 2019, the organization's humanitarian focus has shifted to Congolese and Burundian asylum seekers whose vulnerability and political exclusion is relatively accepted by the state. It has also resorted to decentralization, which allowed the UNHCR to individualize its services using the implementing partners that we're seeing on the slide. And the next slide, please, Joe. So some of the interlocutors that I interacted with argued that the UNHCR had it with some of these shelters, particularly the men's one, and they had argued that they did not mind if this shelter closed down. These individuals accused the UNHCR of perceiving the shelter as too compassionate by allowing Zimbabwean economic migrants to stay for too long, which had implications not only on managing the amount of support the organization would have had to provide, but also posing the risk of ruining the UNHCR standing with refugee law, as well as making coming to South Africa and getting documented look easy. The UNHCR seemed to be appeasing the bureaucratic state by not appearing to violate its legal codes on the issue of refugee camps, valorizing in the process its own legal legitimacy over international protection. Yet this is the same law that was responsible for justifying the deportation of thousands of migrants. UNHCR was now closing office and has now, at a time when Zimbabwean migrants feel they need more support. And some have even perceived this action as part and parcel of xenophobic state practices, while the UNHCR maintains that its exit is a technical managerial issue, suggesting that it was given to it through a process of regionalization and decentralization. I'd like to conclude by arguing that these developments are tied to how humanitarianism is a moving sovereignty, more so by its categorical nature. And here, to use the words of one informant, open quotes, they don't see the refugee anymore. South Africa, no, in the Sub-Saharan is no longer their concern or priority. They are focusing on people who have got real problems, close quote. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you so much, Kuda, and thanks for doing such a wonderful job at sticking to time. I really appreciate that. So we're going to now move on to hear from our colleague Achieng Akena from Uganda, who is going to be talking to us about regional integration and free movements, and touching on issues around deservingness, and are we in a position, sort of drawing from what Kuda has outlined, to be rethinking about the ways in which this, whether we're aging gracefully, I suppose, whether or not this protection humanitarian regime is in fact becoming a form of moving sovereignty, as Kuda suggests, and whether there are ways to improve the ways in which we can respond to displacement, while simultaneously providing protection in ways that are more relevant to our context. So Achieng, over to you. Would you like to share your screen? Or would you prefer I share your slides?
Let me share. Could you do it, please?
Yes, of course.
I assumed you would, so.
No worries, no problem at all.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. It's a privilege to be here at this distinguished conference and to listen to so many learned scholars speak about refugee protection across the globe. I'll be speaking specifically to the Sub-Saharan context, the Sub-Saharan African context. Next slide, please. So by way of introduction, this is a region that hosts up to 26% of the world's refugee population, according to UNHCR. And these numbers are said to be soaring due to ongoing conflicts in places like Central African Republic, Chad, Nigeria, South Sudan, Cameroon, Burundi, Mozambique, Ethiopia, and Yemen, as well as the Islamist insurgency and violent extremism in the Sahel and West Africa, simmering conflict in the Great Lakes region and the Horn and Central Africa. In addition to this violent conflict that's ongoing, we have extremism, we have repressive governance, we have election-related violence, extreme poverty and hunger, climatic pressure, human rights violations, and violence and repressive policies related to gender identity and sexual orientation. These are some of the drivers of population flows and repeat displacements in the region. The median age of migrants is 30, and 45% of them are female. Next slide, please. It is within this context that we are speaking about, that I will be speaking around refugee protection and offering some alternatives. The narrative in Sub-Saharan Africa mostly, and Africa generally as a continent, has primarily been Eurocentric, and the focus and imagery of African refugees and migrants has been, as you may see in the slide, people on rickety boats making their way to Europe across the Mediterranean. Not to denigrate the suffering of the people who we've lost across the seas, but to emphasize that the majority of Africans, up to 88%, actually stay within the region. The African Union's response, therefore, to what was at one point a migration crisis was to inter alia direct the speedy enactment of free movement arrangements for the continent in line with the 1991 AC Abuja Treaty. Free movement is seen on the continent as a means towards reducing unemployment, sharing skills and resources, and promoting inclusive development in Africa, as well as fostering regional integration and a united and integrated continent. The continent has also come up with a number of different instruments towards protecting Africans on the move. The 1969 OAU Convention, the 1980 Lagos Plan of Action, the 1991 AC Abuja Treaty, the 2018 Protocol on Free Movement of Persons, Right of Residence and Right of Establishment, and the 2018 Migration Policy Framework for Africa and Plan of Action. Next slide, please. However, the dynamic of forced displacement in Africa has changed significantly over the past 50 to 70 years, but the core instruments really have not. And I say 50 to 70 years referring to both the African and the global conventions. It is no longer simply populations fleeing and arriving in the country of asylum to wait out a conflict so that they can return. There are protracted refugee situations, repeat displacements, mixed migration flows, of course, in the nuanced way that we heard in the keynote lecture before this, new push factors, and several human rights issues that create a dynamism to forced displacement in the region that do not fit the traditional persecution rubric, and therefore are not adequately provided for by these instruments or within the refugee protection mechanisms developed over time. A useful illustration of this is the contemporary movements of Eritrean refugees who fled their country due to repression, but then made onward journeys as economic migrants from their countries of refuge to Gulf states. However, due to nationalization policies and related hardships in the Gulf states, they were forced back to Eritrea and then displaced again because the situation in which they were fleeing was not adequately, had not been addressed. The repressive regime continues to exist. And so they're then re-displaced to other countries like Uganda and Sudan. But at this point, they find themselves no longer checking the forced displacement box and therefore find themselves excluded from protection. There's also a lot of fluid flows amongst refugees and asylum seekers amongst refugees and asylum seekers between their countries of origin and their countries of asylum through irregular border crossings. I read a recent document that indicated that there has been, they have documented over 200,000 flows through irregular points between Uganda and DRC. And it's mostly people visiting their families, either those who've sought asylum or those who remained back home, some also seeking to be nearer to medical care, for example, during the COVID crisis. Next slide, please. Towards what the African Union calls an integrated, prosperous and peaceful Africa, Agenda 2063, which was adopted some years ago. The continent, on Africa's 50th anniversary, the continent continues to develop norms and build structures for free movement of persons at regional and sub-regional levels. What I seek to propose today is whether these Africa regional integration and free movement regimes could provide some rationality to the fluidity of displacement and migration on the continent, while still allowing for protection for related vulnerabilities. The AU Free Movement Protocol provides for all Africans to be able to move to, reside, and establish themselves in any other African country with a variable geometry implementation model, beginning with the relaxation of visa requirements. The regional economic communities, which are considered as building blocks for the African Union, also provide for various free movement arrangements. ECOWAS has a free movement protocol and the most comprehensive sub-regional free movement regime on the continent. The East African community has free movement written into the common market, which has been enforced since 2010. COMESA has a free movement protocol that is not enforced, but has a relaxation of visa protocol that is enforced. IGAD also has is awaiting adoption of its free movement protocol. SADC has a protocol that was enacted in 2005, or rather adopted in 2005, but has not come into force yet. Of notice that it was a document aimed at facilitating movement and not ensuring it, and maybe it goes somewhere to explain the challenges that Kuda gave us in the previous presentation. ECAS has a free movement protocol being negotiated, but currently only allows free movement for certain defined categories of people like business people and students. And Sunset has free movement ingrained into the founding treaty as a core objective, but has had very little implementation over the years. Next slide, please. There is a need for inclusive approaches. The title of refugee, in my opinion, should not be an exclusionary one. Why shouldn't refugees be able to benefit from regional citizenship and Africa's free movement arrangements while still being able to access protection mechanisms that address their specific vulnerabilities? The current situation is really that refugees are not benefiting at all from any of these arrangements. So for example, countries like Uganda, while being the largest refugee hosting country on the continent, provide legal exclusions for refugees to access citizenship of the country. In other instances, CTDs are not uniform or recognized across different countries, even in the same region. And some countries require refugees to get visas with their CTDs, while not requiring it of the nationals of the country from which the CTDs were obtained. The AU Free Movement Protocol does make some provision for arrangements to be made for refugees to move across the continent, but it does not, in my opinion, go far enough. The regional integration agenda, if dynamically interpreted and applied, could increase refugee integration, expand options for regional solutions, and address protracted situations of displacement. However, there remains a dichotomy between forced and voluntary migration, which means that refugees are often left out of these free movement arrangements and remain largely governed by the 50 to 70-year-old treaties. Next slide, please. I believe that the current challenges of human movement across the continent can be alleviated by the role of the African Union and its member states in boosting positive and legal pathways for migration and free movement, collating informative data for programming, and being prepared for forced displacement flows as a core aspect of continental unity, solidarity, and cohesion. However, without a broader Pan-Africanist and human-centered approach, the concerns around security, nationalism, the impression of scarce resources being shared with locals can and has led to instances of mass expulsions, xenophobia, and segregation of Africans who move. The biggest challenge with human mobility on the continent is not that Africans are moving, but that there's a lack of adequate protection mechanisms for those who do move. This means that vulnerabilities and criminality are exacerbated, with traffickers, enslavers, and human rights violators stepping into the gaps where protection is not availed. For women in particular, the lack of protection mechanisms is severe due to the sectors they mostly migrate to, including entertainment and caregiving industries. The lack of guaranteed access to sexual and reproductive health care puts them at increased risk of maternal mortality. Many African countries have an encampment policy for refugees and remain resistant to integrating them as part of durable and long-term solutions to forced displacement, and migrants often find severe conditions and legislation that deter naturalization and integration into their host countries, leading in certain instances to statelessness, especially of their children. Pan-African of the 20th century must transcend the instruments and institutions into which it has been ensconced. And the spirit and impetus of the call for African solidarity, unity, and self-reliance must be actualized and entrenched in action, as much as it is in discourse. This would result in our doing better by Africans, migrants, no matter the cause of their movement. Africans on the move must be able to do so with dignity and in safety, and have their rights protected, especially for those who are forcibly displaced. They must be able to find safe and dignified and protected asylum wherever they seek refuge on the continent. Thank you, Joe.
Many thanks, Achieng, for such an insightful input that is really helping us bring together and think about the different ways in which forms of disconnection, forms of resultant exclusion, but also issues around relevance are really fueling many of the experiences that people moving on the ground who do or used to or may do meet definitions around being a refugee based on not only the 51 Convention, but also looking at the OAU's 1969 Convention. And I think the issue of relevance, the issues, there's a question from Lucy Hovel, who's also bringing in the idea of sort of different levels in terms of exclusion at the state, if and how does that reflect exclusion or practice at the local level. And I think, again, this form of disconnect between paper and action, between regional and national, between international and regional, are all various issues that I'm hoping are going to continue to come through on the discussion. So please do make use of the chat box. It gives me pleasure to now move over to Nicholas Maple, a colleague from the ACMS, who is going to be sharing with us his reflections on the role of the global refugee regime in shaping refugee reception policies in Southern Africa. And I'm really looking forward to hearing that. I'll hand over to you, Nick. Would you like me to share your slides, or are you going to share your slides?
Do you mind doing it, Joe?
Sure, no worries.
No
worries.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Joe and Kuda and Achieng for the great presentation. Hi all, my presentation today, as Joe mentioned, is on the contemporary role of the global refugee regime in Southern Africa, with a focus on protection in refugee camps and the urban space. It's based predominantly on research I conducted over the last few years as a PhD student at the RLI, which looked at how South Africa and Zambia responded to the arrival of refugees. This research is also, though, supplemented by current projects I'm working on with my colleagues at ACMS through the Protect project, which look at protection of refugees and asylum seekers in South Africa and the wider region. Joe, I can share if that's easier. Yes,
Sorry, no, it's coming. I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine.
There we go. Sorry about that, everyone. Back
Just
to you,
the next slide then, please. So I'm briefly going to talk to 4 points. Introduce the Southern African context and the global refugee regime, Zambia and South Africa's approach to receiving refugees, some observations on the role of international frameworks, and then finally the approach of UNHCR in terms of refugee camps and urban spaces in the region. I think I should just point out here, though, especially in relation to UNHCR, I'm going to be talking about what I see happening on the ground and the effect of the UN agency's approach in Southern Africa. I don't really have time to go into all the factors influencing this approach, of which there are many, and some definitely beyond the control of the UN agency. So just to say, this is not intended to be solely a critique or criticism of UNHCR, but happy to talk about more of this in the Q&A. Next slide, please, Joe. So a quick word on the global refugee regime, which I'm sure you're all aware of, but I'm just to explain how I'm defining it for this presentation. Given the time constraints, I'm only going to look at 2 of its core components: the regime's main international legal framework, which is the 51 Convention, and then the regime's key global actor, UNHCR. In terms of Southern Africa and refugee movements, while the region does not host the vast populations seen in neighboring regions, it's home to a significant number of refugees. For example, UNHCR reported 1.1 million refugees and asylum seekers in the region in 2020. And just to note here that the IDP numbers, particularly from the DRC, are even larger. So to assist states in hosting these populations, the global regime has been associated with refugee protection in the region since the 1960s. Broadly, this assistance has taken a number of approaches. from promoting international standards for states to adopt when receiving and welcoming refugees, to the role of UNHCR and other UN agencies in offering protection and assistance in organized camps and settlements. Certainly since the 1980s, UNHCR has been deeply involved in the architecture of refugee reception by establishing and running refugee camps for host states. Yet for some time, refugee movement in Southern Africa has been following regional and global trends of urbanization, with more and more refugees rejecting refugee camps to settle in cities and towns. As such, many of my colleagues here at ACMS have been questioning for some time now the continuing relevance of UNHCR, and by extension, the global regime in urban spaces in Southern Africa. Next slide, please, Joe. Okay, turning specifically to Zambia and South Africa. Well, these are the two main destination countries in the region for refugees. They interestingly adopt vastly different national policies. On the one hand, Zambia maintains an overarching national encampment policy, with refugees expected to reside in large organized settlements far away from large centers like Lusaka. Nevertheless, via the Office of the Commissioner for Refugees, which is a state body responsible for refugee matters, large numbers of refugees are permitted, either officially or via sort of a blind eye approach, to regularly move back and forth between the settlements and urban spaces via a combination of permits and gate passes. Equally, you also have regular movement within border areas where migrants move back and forth without much, if any, contact with the state or international agencies. For example, when unrest occurs in the DRC, many refugees will flee across the border and stay in border areas with local communities, where permission to reside comes from the locals, before then returning to the DRC when things improve. As Bakewell has previously noted, state involvement in these reception policies at this local level are often minimal or non-existent. In contrast, South Africa, at least in law, permits refugees freedom of movement and the ability to settle anywhere within the country. Although particularly in the last decade or so, I would argue movement is still being continually restricted by national and local level policies, which either confine refugees to specific areas of the city or removing access to cities altogether. So as you can see, these two close neighbours have vastly different approaches to refugee hosting, particularly at the national level. Yet the empirical data still emphasise a number of parallels in terms of the role of the global refugee regime in the two countries. Next slide, please, Joe. So firstly, international frameworks appear to have little influence over how many state actors implement refugee reception policies. Instead, it's national laws, policies, and local norms that are key in practice, with actors in the two countries often implementing national norms rather than international ones. So for example, in South Africa, the 1998 Refugee Act is regularly interpreted through a constitutional lens, with human rights lawyers noting in interviews how submissions regularly start with constitutional law. In Zambia, the old 1970 Refugee Control Act, with its focus on stopping movement and housing refugees in camps, still holds massive sway with state officials and within key departments such as immigration and the police. In fact, it has helped create a conceptualization of refugees as immobile victims in need of international protection or support who should reside in designated settlements far away from built-up areas. And this is a point that I'll come back to in a bit. This lack of focus or attention on international conventions at the local and national level in both countries mean that for many actors working in refugee protection in Southern Africa, international refugee law remains a fairly remote concept. Next slide, please, Joe. Secondly, in terms of UNHCR as the key regime actor, the agency certainly has less influence in Southern Africa than I was expecting before I conducted my research, and from what one might expect from the existing literature. In Zambia, UNHCR focuses attention within the designated settlement. In South Africa, the agency appears to take a very hands-off approach, with many in civil society questioning their role altogether. Indeed, along with the host states, the UN agency essentially adopts a non-interventionist policy in urban spaces within South Africa and Zambia. This means that if a refugee moves to a city from a refugee camp or chooses an urban space over a camp or settlement, there is an implication or expectation on behalf of the refugee to be entirely self-sufficient. Although I should again at this point say that there are some notable exceptions to this non-interventionist policy in terms of implementing partners of UNHCR, doing some pretty extraordinary things with very minimal budgets in urban spaces in both countries. But essentially, when refugees exercise their agency and move to urban areas, they are, for all intents and purposes, leaving the confines of the regime. This is particularly evident in Zambia, where UNHCR sees refugees choosing between the regime, i.e. the refugee settlements, and the urban space. And interestingly, UNHCR, while pushing for freedom of movement behind the scenes with the Zambian state, also still actively choose to remain predominantly inside the refugee camp, with potential services in the city seen as a pull factor away from the settlement. Interestingly, a similar situation also occurs in South Africa, where there is an assumption within many in UNHCR that if a refugee required protection or humanitarian assistance, they would have stopped at a refugee camp in a neighboring state in the region, rather than continuing their journeys to the southernmost country in Africa. These findings, I think, highlight a key contradiction concerning the regime and refugee reception in Southern Africa. The refugee camp was not originally conceived as a core element of the global refugee regime. For example, most rights contained within the 51 Convention really are related to integration of refugees into a host state. Yet, although the refugee camps are established through policy decisions taken by host states, international donors and actors, these sites have now become synonymous with the regime in the region, and I would also perhaps argue the whole continent. Thus, at the heart of the camp-based reception lies this paradox. The global refugee regime, which was designed to convey a wide range of rights to refugees, is confined to a site that it did not create, a site by its very presence inhibits the full implementation of the regime in host countries. This implication of these findings for refugees in Southern Africa is that for them to gain access to the regime and by extension international protection, they must give up their right to freedom of movement and in many respects dehumanize themselves. Okay, turning back to the urban space in the final bit of my talk, this construction of the urban refugee as self-reliant also has the trick, I think, of conferring sufficient agency onto the refugee to relinquish the host state and UNHCR of key obligations imposed by the global refugee regime involving protection and integration. Yet protection concerns remain in urban spaces in both countries. For example, increases in xenophobic violence combined with a lack of perceived protection from the state or UNHCR saw hundreds of refugees gathering at a Methodist church in Cape Town in late 2019. Equally, as a result of this overarching approach by UNHCR in Southern Africa, again in combination with a similar non-interventionist state-based policy, most urban refugees are left to negotiate protection and find alternative forms of reception at the local or community level. While it is true many refugees choose to avoid state and international actors and instead self-settle and remain invisible in cities such as Johannesburg, they have little choice in the matter. Equally, this conceptualization of urban refugees mean that refugees are regularly confused with other migrants in urban spaces. Indeed, I would suggest we are seeing what Betts has referred to in the past as a sort of regime shifting, where urban refugees are being moved from a national refugee framework to more of a national migration framework. Ultimately, these approaches in the two reception sites that I've talked about are reinforcing a dominant conceptualization of who is a refugee, i.e. a passive, immobile victim in need of international support, and where they should reside, i.e. refugee camps. So to conclude, these findings, I think, question the ongoing relevance of the global refugee regime in the reception of refugees in Southern Africa. In essence, as Anna Schmidt has talked about previously, the regime is being confined to the refugee camp, yet the camp and urban space are becoming ever more connected in the region, with refugees regularly moving between these two sites. In turn, increasing numbers of refugees in the region are rejecting the camp space altogether. with the regime being contained within out-the-way geographical spaces, there is a real danger of it becoming entirely irrelevant in the day-to-day lives of a large number of refugees in Southern Africa. That's it, Joe. If you could go to the next slide, but I'm done. Thanks very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nick, for also bringing us a comparative example, which I think is a great way of beginning to help kick off a wider discussion around this sort of framing of deservingness, the framing of who fits the profile of who is considered a refugee, who isn't, and the ways in which that fluidity is also playing out more and more across the region. I also think that, you know, the example of the ways in which refugees who are in urban settings are then being considered to be someone or something different, and being moved onto increasingly restrictive immigration regimes. So the language of protection being undone even further by states viewing those individuals as falling into a different form of a regime. And I think we're increasingly seeing in certain states the ways in which migration management policies and thinking of international migration management is now clumping together these previously discrete categories of people, which in many ways, you know, is about the challenges of categories, and it's about legal definitions and if and how those help in various ways. So I see there's a couple of questions that have come up in the chat, you know, looking at issues around other issues around the role of UNHCR in the region and whether or not they receive more aid from UNHCR and the international community for those who are in camps versus those in urban areas. And that's something that, Nick, it would be great if you could reflect a little bit on as we come to more of the conversation. And a question here to Achieng about whether or not issues around the ways in which states are enabling, are resistant to enabling and facilitating local integration, and if and how that's interacting with the global context around the ways in which responsibility sharing or externalization is failing, and whether there are any examples that you could talk to about this. Whilst we are obviously sad to be missing our colleague today from the panel, it does mean that we have a little more time to engage in a conversation. And I think that with the participation of those in the audience, we've got some interesting starting points to really try and draw these inputs together. And I will try my best to try and corral some conversations here. Sam Davidoff-Gore is asking a question about, well, if the refugee regime is becoming less and less relevant, are there ways to then work with local communities or leverage local support for refugees themselves to provide access to protection in different ways? And in the same way, is there a way to sensitize the refugee regime in these contexts? So thinking again about relevance and applicability in these various contexts. So I wonder, Achieng, if you would be happy to sort of provide some reflections thinking about these issues that have been posed around the role of the state in responding or not, issues around responsibility, and issues around the ways in which states are creating vulnerabilities, and individuals who would not necessarily be considered vulnerable and should not be, are being rendered vulnerable in different ways through state responses. And I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit more to that and those disconnects around protection and vulnerabilities. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. Most certainly, particularly on the continent where more than 30 countries, for example, still prescribe issues around sexual orientation and gender identity, you tend to find that people For example, when Uganda passed the Anti-Homosexuality Act and there was an exodus of refugees into Kenya, when they arrived in Kenya, they failed to find protection because Kenya also prescribes same-sex sexual relations. And so those people who sought refuge in Kenya have had significant challenges accessing protection. Not just, I mean, they've faced several challenges. They've had their tents burnt down, they've had violence meted out against them, and someone actually died a month ago. I think this is just a reflection of how sometimes unhelpful legislation that is against human rights norms goes towards not allowing refugees to actually have safe and protected refuge in the places where they seek it. So while UNHCR tries to provide this protection, it's not enough because UNHCR depends on government agencies, for example, the police, to be able to respond to situations of such violence. But you find, like in situations of LGBTIQ refugees in particular, the Kenyan police don't respond because they consider it a crime and therefore not their responsibility to protect persons who are facing persecution in this way. And so, as I said in my presentation, wherever Africans move to, they need to be able to find safe and protected asylum. And being, I suppose you could say, stuck in the refugee regime has always posed an enormous problem, particularly for those people who are not readily accepted by the country in which they go to. Another example is refugees or asylum seekers who are fleeing political persecution in neighboring countries, say in Rwanda, may not be able to seek, may not be able to get adequate protection if they flee to Uganda because there are either regional cooperation arrangements or something to that effect. And so I don't know if the refugee regime is necessarily set up to deal with some of these very complicated and very intricate issues that affect human lives.
Brilliant, thanks so much, Achieng. And I think that, you know, as you say, it's about whether the regime is able to keep up with the key concerns at hand. And I think somebody had asked a question that was around the question of sort of the role and the inclusion of refugee communities themselves. I mean, there is this question of how definitions are formed and the forms of, you know, the way that individuals have to perform in certain ways in order to meet particular requirements for being considered eligible for various forms of protection in different states. In some ways, that brings us back round to Kuda. You've, I'm sure, been following obviously the chat where there's various questions that are linked to your talk. But I think bringing us back round to thinking about the tensions between, or the separations between the local and the national, the regional, and what that means in terms of protection and who is winning at what point and when, between the state and between peoples. It would be great to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jo. I think, these are categories are useful. I think they articulate themselves in very different ways that, you know, sometimes can be contradictory, wherein the local can be, for example, in the Zimbabwe-South Africa border, the local, which is the site of crisis, can actually be responsive more than perhaps when you're talking about grassroots organizations or faith-based organizations, can be more sensitive to the plight of would-be asylum seekers and offer particular forms of protection, particularly the shelters themselves, where the way that they were formed was through an engagement between these faith-based actors and the municipality, the police, and ultimately getting some buy-in from the Department of Home Affairs, which we could, we could think of as sort of representing the state. So, and we, the work that the Migration and Health Project has done as well in that area shows how there's different forms of innovation there that healthcare providers also resort to in ways to try to counter sort of medical xenophobia or different forms of discrimination that we may find within other sort of metropoles, for example, like such as Joburg, and how these healthcare providers build their own sort of local administrative systems to coordinate and harmonize issues of treatment and different kinds of inclusion. So you do find a certain kind of sociality that perhaps is emblematic of sanctuary cities in the States. But at the same time, these ways of dividing or understanding the state or the different aspects of governance are not necessarily useful when we find the local also reinforcing particular notions of the state. So you will still find migrants, particularly in contexts where, going back to this funding issue, where UNHCR comes in a space. So there's a sort of transformation that happens from humanitarian influx that shifts what it is that we mean by, the differentiation between perhaps the state and sort of the local grassroots, in which there starts to be contestations around resources, for example, about who is going to be managing particular projects when shelters are built, who is going to be putting money into them, and when money doesn't come, which bodies are put on as to become the sides of negotiation. So, for example, in one aspect, in one instance, the men's shelter had not received some new pots from the Future Families, which is the UNHCR implementing partner at the border. And the manager of the shelter was threatening to evict the migrants themselves, the Zimbabwean migrants, who are again, this politics of concern. I think there's a question around this. Who are the problematic ones in this space? These are the bodies that the UNHCR does not want to funnel funds into, rather preferring to support Burundians and Congolese asylum seekers who are not seen as economic migrants. So we see these bodies becoming sides of contestation, and we can almost see how the state becomes reified, so to speak, within these local practices that are perpetually inclusive. So I think we need to be careful about making those kinds of distinctions. So there are ways when it's useful, and there are also ways when it doesn't really help us.
Great. Thank you so much, Kuda. I mean, lots to unpack there. And I think as we move to Nick, one of the sort of reflections that's been coming out, and I think around the theme of the whole conference, is that not only is it about, the ways in which humanitarianism, the humanitarian sector, the humanitarian industry, and the work involved under the ambit of humanitarian responses itself is having to reinvent itself, given the contexts in which responses and needs exist are not meeting the prior ideas. Protracted contexts of displacement are not the same as acute crisis moments. And I think that we've also been seeing in certain areas the way that agencies, which includes UNHCR, are then finding themselves being invited in by civil society to provide responses that are actually fulfilling the responsibility of the state. And so some humanitarian agencies we know have been providing responses in spaces where the state is present, where the state has responsibility, where the state is technically functioning, but gaps in delivery, particularly in the context of protection, are missing. And so we also need to think about this sort of reinvention of the ways in which those that are considered to need protection changes, particularly in the urban context. And I think this links, Nick, back to also the question from Diana Martin around issues in the urban context. So if I can move back to you to sort of provide some reflections on that and some of the other questions that are in the chat towards you. Thanks. Yeah,
no problem. Just to go back a step, if that's all right, to conversation Kuda's having about the different levels. Just to say that I was, when I started the research on protection in South Africa, I was very interested around the role of like the city in Johannesburg as a potential idea that the global refugee regime would sort of skip a level and get in to the sort of city level, sort of re-emerge. And before the past mayor, that was sort of kind of happening. There were some interesting developments around new systems and protection mechanisms, even if like quite minor, but within the city level for refugees, migrants, and undocumented migrants. But then it becomes quite clear if you have a look at any of the sort of speeches by the previous mayor of Johannesburg, that democratic pressures, to me, they're very similar at the city level as the national level. And so when the new mayor, the DA mayor came in, it was all about appeasing short-term issues around voting. And so the discussion around migrants suddenly turned again into sort of a xenophobic discussion. So I like this idea of sort of looking at the different levels and seeing ways of finding protection, but at the same time, I do think these different structures sometimes is missed that they're all kind of nestled within each other. At the same point, it's like the services, and Joe would know more about this than me, but certain services, you can have this decentralization, but many of the services are still funded and run at the national level, even within the city. And so it's a bit difficult to sort of separate them all out. And as Kuda said, I think they're all kind of meshed together. In relation to UNHCR, so going back to the first question from Patricia, I think, yeah, I mean, that was one of the reasons, the sort of classic reasons in the literature about why states keep refugee camps is because it's visible and it creates funding, and it effectively it funds a population like via international funding much better than invisible populations in urban centres where they're not always clear on numbering and registration. And so definitely that is a reason why, part of the reason why camps, I think, are still around. Just on that point, the thing that I would also think is quite fundamental about refugee camps that perhaps we don't always talk about is just them as a way of controlling movement. So you have mass influx of people, and a lot of countries in Southern Africa and on the continent don't have this sophisticated approach of internal externalization of borders. And so camps are a way of controlling and managing the movement of people, even though I don't necessarily think camps stop movement, or even states believe they stop movement, but it's this idea that they are controlling movement. So you get a much more manageable level of refugees coming into urban centres via gate passes or whatever. Appreciate I haven't answered your question, Joe. Around UNHCR in the urban, I mean, to me, the 2009 urban policy and then the 2014 sets out some pretty, I think they're both slightly flawed, but they set out some good ideas about the idea of protection, idea of assisting refugees in urban spaces. But I sort of agree with the Jeff Crisp article a few years ago when it's like how crazy it sounds. I think urban spaces are still quite new to UNHCR, and they're still not quite sure, particularly in the context that we're talking about here, how quite to react. I know I'm jumping around a lot, but just to finish then, Joe, the comment around people taking over state responsibility, the stuff that I was finding in Johannesburg, particularly with civil society, like it's skipping UNHCR to the point where you've got the Catholic Church and other organizations running key services that the state absolutely should be providing. I've got lots of other thoughts, but perhaps I'll let someone else talk now. Thanks.
Brilliant, thanks, Nick. And yeah, to agree, I think the question has been interesting. When I mentioned UNHCR in that, it's about the way that civil society is often turned to UNHCR with the assumption UNHCR can intervene and act. And that in itself, I think, is interesting, looking at the ways in which UNHCR is perceived at different levels, as well as having a role, and how UNHCR is often held up in different ways, right, in terms of its mandate as being able to respond, and civil society often being very disappointed that UNHCR doesn't have a mandate to respond, right? And I think that in itself is also telling of a kind of moment in what we're seeing in different spaces, in different contexts. I was wondering if we could sort of perhaps come to, there's 2 points here that we could perhaps use as we kind of come to a, sort of a final round. Is, I think one of the questions here from Ursula Arends is about data, and I think it's an interesting question, because not only is it about what does the lack of data mean in terms of understanding, but I think Ursula is posing an interesting question that, if I'm interpreting it correctly, suggests that with data, states would want to respond, right? If I'm not sure, Ursula, if I'm reading this correctly, but I'm reading it that the suggestion is that if we can improve data, it's going to support states to improve, formulate, and respond in different ways. Whereas I think that the challenge at the moment is that states do not want to be doing that. I think if we can generalize, we then have some challenges when we think about data, knowing that we need data in order to respond, to develop appropriate responses, but what are those responses, and how data can be used in many different ways, and the politics of data itself. And I think this is particularly relevant when we're talking about a region where the forms of mixed movements, if we want to use that language, and the ways in which migration is and isn't being understood as an issue by states, and the politicization of movement of people, means that data can have a double purpose, right? It can become dangerous to have certain data because it can be used and manipulated in certain ways. And so I'd ask all of the panelists as we go around to perhaps just spend a minute reflecting on issues around data. And if anyone wants to take on the question about what does data mean in a context of movement, and we've seen attempts by agencies, let's think about IOM, for example, around using cell phones to share data, to share information to people on the move, but also inviting people that they can safely and securely load copies of their documents, and that the phone is going to automatically work out where they are to provide geographically relevant information. And the question around surveillance coming in, and I'd appreciate everyone perhaps reflecting on that. And then the final thing is that if you would like to, just in your final sort of minute and a half, 2 minutes, you may prefer to rather focus on what it means in terms of COVID-19 restrictions, and whether the various forms of national responses to COVID have had any effect on further limiting protection. And for some of you, this might be an interesting thing to think about, for example, the ways in which responsibilities for individuals is suddenly further devolved to very local contexts, but also the ways in which we are seeing, and work from the centre is clearly demonstrating, that COVID has prevented opportunities under the guise of a global health security response to further securitize borders, which in the South African context has meant that individuals seeking asylum have been unable to safely enter the country, have been unable to lodge applications, therefore being rendered irregular and undocumented. So I think there's also moments that we need to reflect on that. So maybe Achieng, I could come back to you a couple of minutes, then we'll go to Kuda, then to Nick. Thanks.
Thank you, Jo. Since I have just a couple of minutes, I'll kind of also try and deal with some of the questions that were asked of me previously. So Lucy had asked about the issue around responsibility sharing and externalization, and whether those issues might be responsible for the reluctance of governments to do local integration. I don't know if that is the reason, but governments have cited that the lack of responsibility sharing and the burden that it creates on the hosting country is an issue in terms of their responses to refugee protection. The discussion more generally around migration has been quite contentious, particularly in the joint AU-EU strategy conversations. The particular focus on the northern migration route, which is the route to Europe, versus the other migratory routes within the continent, and the disproportionate allocation of resources to programming around the northern route has been quite an issue of contention between the African Union and the European Union in their conversations. I don't know whether this is the reason for the lack of local integration, or it is just one of the more systemic issues we have on the continent around implementation of treaties and decisions that are made at a regional and sub-regional level. It may be more of a combination of the two, but I would not put all the responsibility for the lack of local integration on this global dynamic. I think there's also some internal issues that need to be addressed in terms of implementation. There was a question as well around local action, and particularly in Uganda, there has been a move to include local governments in implementation of refugee responses, understanding that it is insufficient to program around refugees alone, and it's important to program as well amongst host communities. And so the policy has been around a 70-30 divide, and some discussions around taking it to a 50-50 divide so that resources benefit both host and refugee communities. This has meant that local governments, the district administration has been involved in refugee programming and refugee management, especially the districts in refugee hosting areas. And I think that has been a positive trend that we've seen here in Uganda, as it really brings down the refugee management issue from being just a national government issue to also including the district administration.
Right, Achieng, I'm sorry to cut you off. I'm aware we've just got 5 minutes left. But of course, please do continue to engage with people on the panel. You could be direct messaging each other to continue. So sorry to cut you off. There's so much we could be talking about. Kuda, you've got 2 minutes if you would like to share some final thoughts. Thanks.
Sure, thanks. I don't really have much to say. Maybe just going to say what has already been said, or the proverbial, if we're going to be collecting more data and counting people only to put them in more boxes, then we're not really headed off in the right direction. So, there needs to be genuine political will to include people. There are instances where we do know that countries that have access to more of this data, like Joe was saying, are using this data for all sorts of wrong reasons, right? So if we're going to be doing that only for that, then that's not really helpful. So if it's just for the sake of, creating more boxes and disaggregating more people more according to gender and everything else, and then we're really not going to go anywhere. I think there really needs to be a shift in how people view the migration discourse, and we're really far off from that as things stand. So worthwhile and normative to have data, brilliant, but then there's a bigger conversation to be had at this level than just that, particularly in contexts where the Department of Home Affairs doesn't even want to engage researchers. You can't even score an interview to chat to anyone from there. So I mean, good luck getting them to want to talk more about that. I recall reading a report by colleagues when they were looking at asylum processes and how they were at the Department of Home Affairs, and how they were really persecuted to a point of even trying to be taken to court, litigated against for trying to do research and or collect data in this space, the DHA space. So we're really far off, have a long way to go. And the COVID thing, I think it's the same, that it highlights and pronounces the inequalities that do exist. There have been opportunities as well to show the state that perhaps they need to be thinking more about mobility. So there is an opportunity, and also there is a kind of reinforcement of inequality. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Kuda. Really important issues that obviously we really need to keep returning to. Nick, the last couple of minutes are to you, and then I'll just close. Thanks.
Yeah, very quickly on the question. So thank you, everyone. Caroline talked about sort of issues about doing services for refugees in urban spaces. There's some really good literature on sort of place-based approaches rather than person-based approaches. And then Lauren Van Daal, our colleague, talks about sort of stealth humanitarianism, all worth giving a read. The problem in South Africa, obviously, well, not obviously, but the problem in South Africa is that there's barriers to accessing these services for refugees and forced migrants within city spaces. Christina, freedom of movement, I didn't fully get the question, but perhaps we could talk about it another time. The thing I would say about freedom of movement within a country rather than in a region is that, to me, it's quite straightforward. It's freely move and to be able to settle anywhere you like. Whereas when you're talking to officials or even UNHCR, this idea of like settlements with gate passes, to them is freedom of movement. And to me, that's a crazy conclusion on this idea that it's you've got freedom of movement in the country, you just have to ask, was basically the quote I got. In relation to data, it scares me as always, because it's sort of around, in Zambia, it was this idea of biometrics for refugees, and they got to the point where they could, when a refugee arrived in Zambia, they could sort of track them through the whole continent. And then when you ask UNHCR what you're going to do with that information, they weren't entirely they weren't entirely sure who was going to obtain that sort of data, and that sort of worries me. And it was the same when we were talking to IOM, UNHCR around COVID responses there. The obsession is more and more data, but again, when you sort of try and dig deeper and say, like, what is that data for? Who is it going to? It all becomes a bit vague. COVID, I've got 30 seconds. COVID, in relation to James's comment, the thing that we found, and we've done a few reports, and maybe Joe can share them or we can share with you later, a lot of the responses that we noticed around refugee exclusion, like, they're not new, they just sort of reflect ongoing issues and barriers. Obviously, it makes things out much worse, but they were already there, sort of the securitization and migration, and sort of deportations, offensive, like all these things were already there. It just sort of got worse, basically. Is that fair to say, Joe? I'll stop. It's 30.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone, for such an exciting panel. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, learned a lot. I've popped everyone's emails, addresses. Please do reach out, as I know that one of the things about the online is more of us can engage in some ways, but then we can't follow up. We don't get to have a drink. Bye. Oh, sorry, I thought it closed. Yeah, so just say thanks, everyone, and enjoy the end of the conference, and thank you for joining. So take care. Bye.
Thanks for the question.
Thanks,
Cheers,
everyone.
Joe. Thank
Bye.
you. Thanks.
Thanks, bye.